Marine Lance Corporal Kevin Cahill looked upon an ominous trail ahead of him, with a mission to locate and eliminate North Vietnamese forces known to be in the remote Hai Lang forest of South Vietnam. Cahill was an experienced Marine, and as point man, knew taking a well-worn trail was a bad idea, but orders were orders, so he cautiously stepped onto the trail. Following Cahill were 166 Marines of Charlie Company of the 1st Marine Division. Little did they know, they were walking straight into a deadly trap that would cost many their life. As Cahill proceeded along the trail on top of a small knoll, a blast of machine gun fire poured into Charlie Company's column. A devastating ambush of small arms, grenade, and rocket fire from the NVA had found the Marines. The Marine search and destroy mission quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival, as over 2,000 NVA soldiers surrounded them. Charlie Company was now on the brink of annihilation. For the first 9 months of Charlie Company's deployment, they had been conducting search and destroy operations in the central portion of I Corps, the closest of the 4 core regions to North Vietnam. Their tactical area of responsibility was roughly a 10-square-mile zone anchored around the port city of Hoi An, a fishing village about 20 miles south of Da Nang. The area had it all: rice paddies, sand dunes, mountains, and jungles. Its landscape provided fertile ground for some vicious small unit actions against both Viet Cong units and the occasional larger and better organized North Vietnamese Army, or NVA force. These engagements were typically small but exceedingly violent firefights, ambushes, and sniping. The VC were also masters in the employment of booby traps, which claimed many Marine lives, especially in the earlier years of the war. That all changed, however, on October 8, 1967, when the 1st Battalion, along with the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Marines, boarded a C-130 aircraft in Da Nang for a 25-minute flight to what they were told was up north, much closer to the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. They touched down in Dong Ha and promptly climbed aboard large military trucks for transport to a location outside the city of Quang Tri. There, the Navy's Construction Battalion, affectionately referred to as Seabees, was hard at work bulldozing a new landing strip called Site X. Here, Charlie Company was informed that they would be providing security for the Seabees. This area, adjacent to the DMZ separating South Vietnam from North Vietnam, was under the operational control of the 3rd Marine Division. Also operating in this area was both the 9th NVA Regiment and the 808th Viet Cong Main Force Battalion. These 2 units controlled the mountainous region inland from the South China Sea to the Laotian border. In this rugged terrain, they had positioned numerous anti-aircraft guns on the mountaintops. These guns were responsible for an alarming number of shoot-downs of U.S. aircraft, mostly helicopters, flying low over the treetops of the thick jungle canopy in an area known as the Hai Lang National Forest. 3 days after their arrival up north, the 3rd Marine Division, with 1st and 2nd Battalions attached, set off on Operation Medina, the purpose of which was to seek out and destroy those guns and the NVA force that had been freely operating in this region. Charlie Company was designated the point company for the mission and would be positioned approximately 1,000 meters ahead of the 3 other companies designated Alpha, Bravo, and Delta that comprised the battalion. The rationale behind this plan was that in case a large enemy force was set up ahead in the jungle for an ambush, Charlie Company could spring the trap rather than all 4 companies being caught together in an NVA trap. At 1100 hours on October 11th, Charlie Company's first wave boarded 14 U.S. Army UH-1 Huey helicopters for the 20-minute flight to a landing zone, or LZ, on a low hilltop clearing deep within the dense triple canopy Hai Lang National Forest. After landing on their small LZ, they set up a defensive perimeter and waited in the hot sun until Charlie Company's 3 platoons were all on the ground. The company then moved off single file into the thick Hai Lang National Forest growth. Movement was slow due to the steep terrain and heavily vegetated mountainsides. Known as a rainforest, the Hai Lang had 3 different layers of forest growth so dense that neither sun nor rain actually penetrated directly to the ground. Any rain that fell merely dribbled down the leaves, branches, and tree trunks. Progress was further slowed by a particularly swift neck-deep stream that lay in their path. The Marines held their rifles in cartridge belts above water with one hand and clinging to a rope spanning the river with the other, they struggled against the current and slippery river bottom as they made their way across. Darkness fell by the time the last Marine reached the far bank, wet and fatigued. They found a reasonably defensible clearing and set into the perimeter for the night. Within minutes of assuming their two-man positions behind trees, they discovered that leeches were abundant in the rainforest, and each of them felt these bloodsuckers crawling up their legs and around their torsos. Throughout the night, one Marine maintained a watch in each fight position, listening for any sign of movement, while the second man tried to get some sleep, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. At sunrise, they rose and set about removing the multitude of slimy black leeches that had attached to their bodies during the night and moved out, continuing on with their mission. They found the vegetation growing incrementally thicker, such that the point man was having to use his machete to hack a path through the vines and shrubs in order to move just 25 or 30 feet ahead at a time. During these inevitable pauses, the Marines behind the point man constantly scanned the jungle, alternating left and right, staying alert for the North Vietnamese they knew were in the area. Eventually, they came across an obvious and well-used NVA trail for a short distance from their position. Captain Bill Major, the company's commanding officer, or CO, radioed back to their battalion commander and advised him of their situation. After weighing the available options, none of them good, Major was ordered to move onto the trail and proceed as best they could toward the day's objective. Accordingly, at about 1400 hours on October 12th, they moved out of the thick forest vegetation onto the trail. Each of them, but especially Captain Major, recognized the inherent danger this move would present. But they also understood that it was necessary to gain the high ground near their objective before nightfall. Within 30 minutes of starting on the trail, their worst fears were realized: an ambush. Roughly 50 yards ahead of the experienced point man, Lance Corporal Kevin Cahill, who was leading Charlie Company, a loud burst of heavy machine gun fire erupted from at least 2 well-concealed bunkers. Cahill was struck down first as bullets flew down the long axis of the trail. These heavy machine guns raked the Marines in the lead platoon, and within the opening seconds they had several Marines down, both on the trail and along the foliage on the sides of the trail. Those Marines behind the lead squads immediately pushed forward to take up positions behind what little cover was available and return fire to recover any fellow Marines who were still alive. As their volume of return fire steadily increased, the NVA fire gradually began to diminish. Finally, it ceased altogether as they beat a hasty retreat back up a small knoll to their rear. Battle dressings were applied to the wounded as the call went out for emergency medevac helicopters. Meanwhile, the rest of the Marines at Charlie Company moved up the path that the retreating NVA had taken to keep the pressure off. There, they moved off into the tree line and established a defensive perimeter around the hilltop. Marine engineers began clearing trees to permit the medevac choppers to descend into this small clearing. They prepared the seriously wounded for the immediate extraction. The most seriously wounded would fly out first, the dead would fly out last. Soon the sound of the approaching helicopters alerted Marines to prepare for almost certain action from the NVA that would try to shoot the choppers down. The first helo descended through the trees with little room for error. The blades were only 10 feet from the tree branches surrounding the tight LZ. They loaded 5 of the most seriously injured onto that first helo. The less seriously injured were loaded aboard the next 3 helos that followed. As the 5th and final helo began to descend through the trees, a whistle sounded from the dense forest and the Marines' perimeter erupted into heavy automatic small arms fire as a company of attacking NVA regulars hit the Marine lines. The focal point of the intense fighting became the medevac LZ, and in the course of the hostile attack, an enemy grenade landed in the immediate area occupied by Corporal Thomas Perkins Jr. and 3 fellow Marines. Realizing the inherent danger, Perkins shouted the warning "grenade" to his fellow Marines, and in a valiant act of heroism without hesitation, hurled himself over the grenade, absorbing the impact of the explosion with his body, saving the lives of his comrades at the cost of his life. Perkins would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on this fateful day. The Marines responded with their own automatic fire into the approaching ranks of the NVA as they struggled up the slope toward the established LZ. As their fire slackened, a second whistle sounded and another company of NVA launched its own attack towards the Marines' left flank. As the Marines on that flank furiously poured fire into the attacking NVA, a third whistle sounded and 2 more NVA companies simultaneously began their charge up the slopes from every direction. The NVA had the Marines completely surrounded and were tightening the noose around the weakened American perimeter. Charlie Company continued pouring fire into the attacking ranks of enemy soldiers as darkness began to fall. The battle went back and forth through the night. The fighting was described by Marine veterans as, quote, horrendous, close, incredibly violent, and uneasy. What each Marine experienced was highly personal, and even then, after the fighting subsided, none of us discussed what had taken place. Were it not for an Air Force C-47 aircraft that had arrived on station above the Marines and dropped life-saving flares to help illuminate the slopes of the hills that they were defending, it's highly likely the NVA force would have succeeded in overrunning Charlie Company and annihilating them. The Air Force was on a life-saving mission that night. As the battle progressed and the fury remained, each Marine realized they were running low on ammunition. Orders spread to stay off full automatic and fire at individual targets only on semi-automatic. In a desperate effort to keep the clusters of NVA attacks from making it through their shrinking perimeter, the Marines began counterattacking down the hill into the NVA as they approached up the slope in pure desperation for survival. The casualties continued to mount for both sides, and they were forced to contract their perimeter again and again. Many Marines had run out of 5.56 ammo for their M16s and were now resorting to AK-47s and grenades picked off dead NVA soldiers. Some were now employing their own entrenching shovels, machetes, and anything else they could lay their hands on for savage hand-to-hand combat. Each Marine, both wounded and unwounded, understood that their ability to repel the North Vietnamese was now measured in minutes, not hours. The roar of gunfire was visualized in pitch black, with the NVA's light green tracers and the Marines' darker red tracers flying in all directions. Realizing how desperate the situation had become, Platoon Commander First Lieutenant Jack Ruffer, in a deep baritone voice, began belting out the first stanzas of the Marine hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, he began. His voice rose above the sounds of the battle. Other Marines still on their feet, facing the approaching NVA below, as well as many of the wounded who were still on the line facing the enemy, joined their voices with Ruffer's. We will fight our country's battles on land and on the sea. The chorus rose above the din of the firing as the Marines who were still alive rallied for what many Marines assumed would be their last assault down the slope and die with the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. However, as they moved down the slope through and over individual NVA soldiers as their coordinated attacks started dissipating into individual and small group efforts, the Marine advance petered out along with their singing of the hymn. Exhausted physically and emotionally, the Marines turned and began struggling back up the slope. But Ruffer alone continued charging down the hill past small groups of NVA. Wounded but still moving, he gradually made his way onto the trail that they had marched down just hours before. Unbeknownst to Charlie Company, soon after the NVA forces had begun to surround them, Captain Major had called back to their battalion commander and reported the urgency of the situation. Charlie Company, at that time of the ambush, was about 1,000 meters ahead of the rest of the battalion as planned. The other three companies were set in on a hilltop in a well-established defensive position. But when the battalion commander received the desperate call from Captain Major, he dispatched Delta Company and rushed to their assistance. They, too, would have to travel that same NVA trail that had exposed Charlie Company to the deadly ambush. But the Marines came to help their brothers. Moving back up that trail, Lieutenant Ruffer, carrying a .45 automatic pistol in hand, began calling softly, "Delta, Delta," concerned that Delta's point man would mistake him for an enemy soldier. But he soon encountered Delta's point man who had heard his calling. After briefly conferring with Delta's company commander, Lieutenant Ruffer led Delta Company back down the well-trodden trail once more. As they approached the rear of the encircling NVA force, Delta Company, with fresh ammunition, fought their way through the enemy lines and spread out across what was left of Charlie Company's small defensive perimeter. It was now the early morning hours of October 13th, with a couple hours until daylight. With Delta's reinforcements stabilizing the Marine lines, they were finally able to tend to their dead and wounded. Then, most of them simply dropped to the ground in exhaustion. This wasn't the end of their contact with the NVA forces during this operation, but it was the end of Charlie Company's fight for survival. The Marines claimed 40 NVA dead around the perimeter, while Marine losses were 8 dead and 39 wounded. The Marines continued their broader search and destroy mission, finding a number of recently evacuated NVA camps. but the NVA avoided any further engagements with the Marines. Operation Medina concluded on 20 October 1967, and the 1st Marines stayed in the area and began Operation Osceola with limited results. Operation Medina was indecisive. The NVA were not driven out of the high-lying forest, but their operations were severely disrupted. Total Marine losses were 34 dead and 143 wounded, while the U.S. claimed that 53 NVA were killed and 3 captured, among hundreds wounded. In the weeks after this battle, after Charlie Company returned to the Sidex airstrip, Marines from Alpha, Bravo, and Delta companies shared how when they were dug in on a hilltop 1,000 meters to the rear of where Charlie Company was ambushed, they had listened to the roar of gunfire for over 4 hours. As the noise of heavy firing diminished by the last minute, they heard the first line of the Marines' hymn, first softly, then more forcefully as voice after voice joined in. They said that the singing, mixed with the sounds and sights of battle, like the red and green tracers flying through the air, was profoundly moving. Many veterans who were there said, quote, "It raised the hair on the back of our necks." That esprit de corps associated with the Marines' hymn in the face of overwhelming odds against a numerically superior enemy added an inspiration that without, who knows what may have happened that night. But what is known in the records of history is that Charlie Company of 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment of the 1st Marine Division upheld the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps on October 12, 1967. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified of our next drop into combat. Stay tuned.